People sometimes ask about a business divorce, and I want to be clear, like, there's actually two meanings to that. One is when a business owners need to split a business, that they're not married, business owners don't want to be partners anymore. We're not going to talk about that one. The other one is when business owners, either one or both spouses that are contemplating divorce, own a business. They own one together, or one of them owns one. It actually surprises some spouses to learn that this business that they built during the marriage is marital property. And that, even though on the business it says, CEO, 100% shareholder or 75% shareholder with other shareholders, that the spouse whose name is nowhere on the business whatsoever actually has 50% of those shares that the other spouse has. It is like any other marital property. So a business that is built during the marriage is marital property and is subject to division just like anything else. It's not easy because what does it look like to divide a business? Businesses that aren't like Apple or Google that have shares. You can't just like take a pizza store or a garage or a financial services business and just rip it in half. That doesn't work. You can destroy all the value of the business. So you have to figure out what is the business worth. And just awarding shares doesn't make it happen. Doesn't affect the division in any meaningful way. So you evaluate, get an assessment of how much the business is worth. What is the value of the business? And then the spouse who's not receiving the business might demand that they receive other assets instead. So let's say the wife has built a successful financial advising business and she wants to keep it. So the husband, and then let's say the business evaluator comes in and says it's worth $1 million. Well, then the husband would be able to demand $1 million in other assets from the divorce if the wife wants to keep the business. Another alternative is that the wife might get actually only $500,000 because the other half stays with the wife, right? But the other option would be the wife would get a loan on the business to pay $500,000 to pay half the value of the business out as a buyout of the other spouse's interest in the business. And there are other creative ways to do this. Where it gets really difficult is the valuation, because unless you're selling the business, which is another option, sell the business, split the proceeds, how much the business is worth is a very subjective question. It is worth whatever some willing buyer is willing to pay. But if you're not going to talk to a willing buyer, you have to hire a business evaluator to assess the value of the business. And two business evaluators two appraisers of the business might disagree, sometimes disagree quite a bit as to the different valuations of the business. And this is where having an excellent lawyer be able to advocate for whatever value you want. If you're the owner, you want it to be a low value. If you're the other spouse, you want it to be a high value. And to argue for what your expert, what your evaluator, if you didn't share one, says the value of the business is, and then to work on that just like any other asset in the marital estate. The division of businesses is one of the most expensive and time-consuming portions of dividing a marital estate. If there are one or more businesses in that marital estate, it behooves the spouses to come to an agreement on how that's going to be handled rather than spend what is often a large amount of money to have that business assessed, have that business appraised, and then divide the business, which might be very difficult to divide. So this is something to be entered into with a great deal of care and with lawyers that are experienced in advocating for the valuation of the business that you want to find. If you want to avoid the difficulties in dividing a business in divorce, in going through the appraisals and going through the legal wrangling, which can be very expensive, sometimes the cost of doing it exceeds the value of the business. I mean, that's how difficult it can be. One way you can kind of circumvent that is to early on come to a premarital agreement as to what's going to happen to the business if it existed before the marriage. Or if you start a business during the marriage, have a marital agreement that defines what happens to this marital estate, this marital asset in the marital estate. Also, in addition to having those agreements in the marriage, you should speak with a business lawyer about putting a buy-sell agreement or other agreements in the business as to how the spouses are going to deal with one another should they no longer be married. So not only do you want to have a marital agreement, but you want to have an agreement inside the business handled by lawyers familiar with business agreements to describe how the parties are going to handle the dissolution so that, for instance, they aren't forced into being partners in a business once they're no longer married. And that can be something that happens. And so a good buy-sell agreement inside the business itself can also be very important to resolving the dissolution of a marriage without it ending up in the dissolution of the business.